So for the purposes of this study, non-dual consciousness was defined as the loss of a sense of fundamental distinction between subject and object. So it is a way of experiencing life where the felt sense of separation that most people experience from their environment dissolves, and all objects and experiences appear as one arising. So as most of you probably know, this shift in perception has been described and pursued by spiritual, religious, and philosophical traditions for millennia. And only recently has it become a subject of scientific study. And this kind of research is really important to understand more about the full potential of human awareness and development. And given the extraordinary psychological qualities that are often associated with non-dual consciousness, like fundamental peace and freedom from psychological suffering, universal compassion and love, its study can also shed light on the highest states of human well-being and freedom. So this study that I'll be talking about today is a qualitative interview study of the lived experience of 10 people who claim to experience non-dual consciousness. So the data was analyzed using thematic analysis, and 3 themes were identified. The first was sense of self, which contained the sub-themes Transcendence, Imminence, Unity and Individuality, and knowing as pure subjectivity. The second was falling away of ego and contained sub-themes deconditioning and non-agency, and the final theme was psychological benefits, which contained the sub-themes inner well-being and acceptance and perfection. So I won't go through all of that. You can pause this and on the recording and read that if you want to. But what was interesting was that at the center of participants' experience of non-dual consciousness lay a fundamental shift in their experience of self. And this is what appeared to bring about the unique psychological qualities described in the theme of psychological benefits. So as participants themselves also suggested, this shift in a sense of self could be conceived of as the cause and the psychological change as the effect. So given the primacy of the shift in participants' experience of self, I'm going to focus primarily on aspects of that theme, sense of self, for this talk. So I obviously won't go into all the relevant data given the time we have, but I'll try to cover the main points. So the first aspect I'll talk about is transcendence. And that is that participants all report a sense of self that they perceive as being beyond form and experience. So this was often described as the self being pure awareness or consciousness, which is foundational and distinct from both internal and external experiences. So that is from its phenomenal contents. Having neither form nor phenomenal attributes sort of conceivably leads people to describe pure awareness with terms like emptiness and spaciousness, like an expansive experience of self that has neither content nor locality. At the same time, participants typically also described an experience of fullness, interpenetrating that emptiness. So I'll read this quote here. Everything is empty and yet full. It is brimming with life, but life that you cannot hold in your hands. It is like light dancing on water, so unmistakably there, yet impossible to grasp. So emptiness is not experienced as a blankness, but is used as a term to point towards that which is empty of content and phenomenal attributes. These qualities mean that it's often described as indefinable, yet also continuous and unchanging, in contrast to experience, which is impermanent. So here's another quote. We may not know what it is, but we know that it is. It's that which precedes every experience, is very available during the experience, and remains after the experience goes away. It's not harmed by anything. It's untouchable, unharmed, unperturbable. So in essence, participants experience the self as immutable and transcendent of all phenomenal experience, yet as the sort of indefinable context of all experience. So the second theme that emerged was what I've called imminence. As we just discussed in the theme of transcendence.
Prosecution rested last Friday, and let me tell you
what. Okay, back to it. Yeah, so that theme of transcendence, participants reported a sense of self that felt like it was beyond or independent of manifest phenomena. Yet it also feels like that transcendent self is simultaneously immanent in or pervading all of existence. So this was often described as a sense of unity with all of life, or as awareness and its content being one and the same. So here's a quote describing that. I'll read it to you. There is always the I behind that is the knower of this. And the first stage was when it was at the background of every experience. But after a point, there was no more separation. The experience and the awareness of it had no separation. Awareness is experience, experience is awareness. Those final words are very similar to the classical Buddhist text, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, which is the Heart Sutra. So awareness is experience, experience is awareness. Both express a perception of an essential unity of phenomena and awareness, or put another way, that non-dual awareness pervades all phenomenal content arising within it, recognizing phenomena as essentially not other than itself. So this quote also describes a similar progression to a number of other participants, from recognizing the self as the transcendent knower of all experience to experiencing knower and known as one, as that subtle duality between awareness and experience disappeared. So perceptually, people often describe this in ways that suggest that there's no subject, no object, and no center to experience. So there's an example: reality is experiencing. There is no experiencer. There is no thing that is experienced. There's only experiencing. Without the dualistic positions of subject and object, there's only experience without separation or boundaries. So this perception of unity of all experience feels so fundamental that's often described as perceiving the underlying reality of all existence, which feels more real than anything else. So this is typically described in ways that suggest a simultaneous experience of transcendence and imminence. That is, despite the sense of self pervading all of existence, it simultaneously feels uncontained by and independent of any particular manifestation of existence. So, as we can see so far, non-duality appears to be associated with a kind of capacity to experience seemingly opposing perspectives simultaneously, like emptiness and fullness, transcendence and imminence. So similarly, participants' reports in the study suggest that from the perspective of non-duality, the self is experienced as simultaneously individual and universal. Experience of self is bound by neither the perspective of individuality, as egoic consciousness is, nor by the perspective of unity, which is classically associated with non-dual states of consciousness. Instead, all perspectives, states, and levels are experienced as having the same underlying reality. So rather than being a merging of the individual with the universal, there is the subjective recognition that they were never separate to begin with. So most participants seem to consider their remaining perception of difference and individuality to be functional, practical in the context of human experience. So I'll read you this quote. For all practical purposes, going to your job, getting something done, getting your car fixed, there's a sense of a certain identity, but that only caters to what I want. If there's something that needs to be done for you, for your family, that's the time when the concept of a separate self might be important. But other than that, overall, there's no identity as such. So the perception of a separate self is functional, but isn't identified with. So essentially, the cognitive and perceptual processes that operate in separation are necessary for normal functioning, but the foundational and unchanging context within which they arise doesn't need to be obscured by them. So participants also described a quality of fluidity to this multifaceted experience of self, where the sense of self isn't fixed, but fluctuates in emphasis between unity and individuality. So here's someone describing that. There is an incredible flow, as though myself can move between being the individual and being the oneness behind it all as the moment calls for, truly free. So ultimately, instead of being a shift from one perspective to another, the change in sense of self in non-duality could be described as an increasing non-fixation in any one perspective or positionality. Kinds of progressions participants described in their state of consciousness over time also related to increasing inclusion of seeming opposite perspectives, which in turn led to greater flexibility and integration in their systems. So, participants' experiences of non-dual consciousness all seem to center around a fundamental shift in what their self is experienced to be. The sense of self feels rooted in pure consciousness, which simultaneously is experienced as the context and substance of all existence. So one thing that's interesting is that this persistent shift out of identification with the narrative-centered or separate sense of self may distinguish non-dual consciousness from the many other types of religious and peak experiences that are also described in the literature. There's a difference between having a supernormal experience within the context of a separate sense of self, and that sense of self falling away entirely to reveal a more foundational level of being. So this sense of self shifting or dissolving appears to underlie the unique psychological qualities that emerge with non-dual consciousness. So examples from participants in the study include that when no separation was experienced between self and other, universal love arose. And when their essence felt untouched by all experience, unconditional peace was realized. So the primacy of identity in the transition to non-duality is important to note, since the psychological benefits appear to emerge as effects of the fundamental shift in identity and not vice versa. This means that it might be worthwhile to investigate what could make the shift available to people who don't experience it, and whether this could inform approaches to alleviating human psychological suffering, given that no traditional psychotherapy questions the reality or necessity of functioning through the narrative-centered, separate sense of self. So one more thing to note about this change in sense of self is that the data in this study suggests that non-duality, rather than being a single state, is more like a continuum of experience that one can deepen into. There seem to be two concurrent processes experienced in its deepening. On one hand, there is a shift in the experience of self in the direction of being all transcending and all pervading. And on the other hand, there is a deconditioning or falling away of the conditioned and narrative-based locus of self, which is often difficult or can not be easy for people to experience. So while participants report that the former, that shift in sense of self, can occur instantaneously, the latter, that deconditioning, appears to take time. And the topics in this talk relate largely to the former. And similarly, most literature in the field fails to address the latter. So this is definitely, these interwoven processes are a great subject for further research, because it can help us to better understand timelines, what helps or hinders these processes, how they interact, how to safely guide people through the transition, what challenges arise, how to navigate them, and even the psychological and neurological processes involved. Oh my goodness, there's a line on the slide. So the finding that non-duality could more accurately be represented as a continuum of related experiences rather than a single uniform state deserves further discussion in the context of this kind of research. So while a change in sense of self is central to any transition into non-duality, participants describe subtly and even obviously different experiences of self, with some describing a transition to deeper or more complete experiences of non-duality over time. So as you all probably know, and definitely do if you listen to the last talk, Jeffrey has extensively researched the continuum of these types of states of consciousness, and his work suggests that there are many more subtleties to this process than could possibly have been discerned from this study, given the small sample size. And this is a significant limitation to the study and previous studies in this field that are similar in design. So rather than being a single state, non-dual consciousness is a continuum of related experiences that vary between different locations on that continuum, which has not been considered in this study or others like it. It's possible that participants found themselves in different locations, or that their recruitment materials would have biased the sample towards one or more specific locations. And taking these distinctions into account will give future research greater focus and clarity, since the psychological and phenomenological attributes of different locations are likely to differ. It also means that a more homogeneous sample can be recruited, which can highlight shared experiences or attributes that may be overlooked as idiosyncratic if you have a sample of individuals at various locations on the continuum. So what's perhaps even more relevant is that there are various layers of depth in each location, as you know from the talk we just listened to. And these are often experienced in a partially integrated way, or with a degree of flexibility between them. This means that a lot of subjective reports of individuals are really a smear of phenomenologically distinct layers of experience, which get confounded in a typical thematic analysis. This sort of essentially results in themes that are not clear or accurate representations of the complex and multidimensional territory they're attempting to describe. So for example, most of the participants in this study would have been in location 2, perhaps some of them in location 3. They were more or less exclusively describing layers 2 and 3 in these locations, and often an integrated form of them. So the descriptions of emptiness or spaciousness that is simultaneously full is an example of this, where the quality of emptiness relates to layer 2 and the quality of fullness to layer 3. So instead of being explored as distinct levels of depth, they were conflated into a single construct, which means that most of the useful detail for navigating and understanding these states of consciousness was lost. Some participants were actually describing the deepest centerless aspects of layer 3, but in the analysis, there was no way to distinguish or position these relative to the experiences that related to shallower layers of depth. Let's go on. So the themes were also relevant to a relatively narrow range of experiences on the continuum as a whole, or the matrix as a whole, that happened to show up in the research population. For example, the notions of transcendence and imminence that I just spent quite a while talking about would be completely meaningless at layer 4, but they appear to be universal in the data, and simply because everyone was describing layers 2 and 3. The same is true of sense of self. In layer 4, particularly from location 4 on, there's no sense of self at all to speak of. So what looked like perfectly valid conclusions were based on a limited data set and were therefore effectively inaccurate, or at least only conditionally accurate. So in other words, there are many different kinds of non-duality, and depending on the location and layer of depth within it, each of these spots has its unique phenomenological and psychological qualities that distinguish it from every other way of experiencing non-duality. every spot subjectively feels like the most real and true when someone is experiencing it. So this has historically led to a lot of disagreement and confusion about what these states actually are. And this, of course, is further complicated by the natural flexibility between different layers of depth in a location, such as location 2 or 3. So the whole theme, unity and individuality that I spoke about, could be summarized by fluidity in layers of depth, where the sense of individuality related to layer 1 and the underlying experience of unity relates to deeper layers in location 2 and 3. Participants describe both a simultaneous or integrated experience of these layers, as well as fluctuations and salience between them, which would relate to subjective perception moving into deeper or more shallow layers of depth in an overall flexible system. So another example of where the understanding of the layers of depth is relevant is in understanding the nature of the change in sense of self that the participants were describing. In progressions, they described, these related to changes in location or depth, very often just depth. And without a comprehensive map to contextualize these experiences, it's not possible to discern meaningful or accurate patterns in small sample sizes like this kind of qualitative study. So based on participants' accounts, the deepening of non-dual consciousness seemed to be experienced as an essentially destructive process, wherein the former sense of a separate self progressively dissolved, revealing what they perceived as the pure consciousness that was always there at the foundation of experience. So it appears that the experience is not characterized by becoming something more or new, but by consciousness withdrawing identification from its phenomenal content and recognizing itself as foundational to all experience. So that is rooting into increasingly undifferentiated and foundational layers of experience. These in turn would relate to subjective perception being drawn into progressively earlier and more simple brain structures, while disassociating from the more complex surface layers where a more differentiated and complex sense of self exists. These deeper layers are always present, and so in line with participants' subjective accounts or perceptions, are merely revealed as attention is drawn away from the activity at the surface layers. What's not clear to them, or to researchers without an understanding of the underlying neuroscience or without really extensive data, is that these surface layers continue operating even after they're out of subjective perception. The experiences of fluidity between layer 1 and the deeper layers, or between individuality and unity, as I described them, is an example of this, as are individuals who subjectively no longer experience having any mental activity, yet continue functioning relatively normally. Essentially, the cognitive and perceptual processes that operate in more complex layers of the nervous system are necessary for normal functioning, but are able to operate partially or completely out of subjective perception, depending on how deep a person is on the continuum. So there can also be a meta-awareness of what's happening at layer 1 from within a deeper layer, resulting in the sense that mental activity is impersonal and spontaneous, as quite a number of participants in the study described. So, as it's hopefully clear by this point, the understanding of the locations and layers of depth is essential to effectively understanding these and studying these states of consciousness or ways of experiencing life. So unless someone is working with hundreds of participants, it'll be very difficult to make useful or meaningful interpretations of data without it being properly contextualized in this way. So I hope everyone out there working on this will take that into consideration. And yeah, that's all I have to say for now. Thank you so much for listening. It's been really an honor to speak here, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If anyone, I don't know how much time is left. I can't see the time at the moment, but if there's time and anyone has questions, I'd be happy to chat to you. That would be fun.
I think it's safe to say you've got a couple minutes.
Okay.
So go for
I'm
it.
not sure how to get out of this.
Yeah, I would.
Oh,
Like
I can stop the screen share.
I would like to ask research. Could you talk a little bit about who your subjects were?
They were just people that specifically they weren't spiritual teachers. So a lot of the prior research that's been done of this nature, a lot of the people that were recruited were spiritual teachers, probably because they were most reliable, as there was people were sure that they were actually experiencing something, but there could be biases in that they may be wanting to represent these states of consciousness as desirable because their livelihood depended on it and that sort of thing. And they may have had, particular kinds of experiences that made them more inclined to be teachers and so on. So it was really just ordinary people that experienced this kind of state of consciousness. People like school teacher, computer scientists, whatever, ordinary people.
You did have also regular school teachers and scientists. Is that what you said?
Yeah. There was someone who was a data scientist, someone was a school teacher, someone was a. There were one or two students. I can't remember everything at this moment, but it was just ordinary people.
I think the work that you're doing along with Martin and with that a lot of this could be connected to some of the writings in the yoga culture. For instance, like the yamas and the niyamas, which you might be able to, I'm sure you could connect those. I mean, they could be connected. And certainly there's a lot that can be connected. I think it's great what you're doing because everybody goes through these things in their mind, whether they're aware of it or not. This is the way the mind works. So for the future, I think it's significant for the future kind of psychology.
Great, thank you. And I'll look into those yamas that you mentioned. It's interesting for sure. I imagine we're out of time.
Can I ask you one question?
Sure. I mean, actually, if Jeffrey wants
you
to
describe the psychology of these people and the location, but how much you look at how they behave in the world is because like in higher location or like 4, they don't feel as they've got any purpose or motivations. But on the other hand, they continue to behave in the world and continue to influence the society, etc. Do you feel they've got any purpose in their behavior different than other people or not? Or they continue exactly to live the same life without changing the purpose of their life or what they're doing?
It depends. Very often people will continue doing the same thing because it's essentially like they're disassociating from that layer where there's meaning and purpose and where the mind is. And that just continues operating on its prior conditioning. But some people will make changes. And definitely by location 4, the tendency is to increasingly isolate and sort of kind of withdraw from the world in some way. Not always, but can be. But yeah, behavior can change, but it can also kind of keep operating on conditioned pathways.